Well, good morning, everyone. Good morning to the second day of the Social Outcomes Conference. And good morning to the first deep dive of today. I'm Andrea Anastasio. I'm the chair for this incredible discussion where we're going to be exploring outcome funds with, quite frankly, some of the most experienced evaluators and practitioners in the world, dare I say. I dare say it. And it's a real honor to be in such distinguished company this morning, or actually for those of you joining us on Zoom afternoon, evening. I know we have colleagues from Australia joining us. Some of us will be joining us, in fact, on the panel. So we're welcome to everyone. I think we can skip the housekeeping because we've already been together for a whole day. We're going to do our best to make sure this is a really engaging session. So we're going to be stopping throughout the discussion, not only to take questions from the audience, but actually to get your thoughts. So have your phones ready for Slido polls. And those of you on Zoom, my colleagues will share the Zoom links in the chat. Sorry, not the Zoom links, the Slido links. Let me just briefly introduce our wonderful panelists. And I'm really pleased and proud to say that in true GoLab spirit, we're bringing together a really diverse mix of experiences. So we're bringing together different types of expertise. So from research and evaluation on my right-hand side, Neil, welcome, from ATQ Consultant, and our lovely Elle, who needs no introduction. And really, I don't think it's any exaggeration to say that Neil and Elle are really two of the most knowledgeable people when it comes not just to outcome funds, but to outcomes-based partnerships, and not just in the UK, but globally. So Neil and Elle, welcome. I should also add, in the research and evaluation corner, we also have my lovely colleague, Emily. Emily, wave at everyone. Emily is not on the panel just because we ran out of space up here, but she's obviously been doing amazing work within the GoLab, working on the evaluation of the Life Chances Fund, outcome funds, and she's keen to connect with you all if you're interested in learning more about her research and hopefully contributing to some of the juicy questions that she's interested in. And I know she'll share more in a moment. On the practice side, we have two incredible individuals joining us from the Education Outcome Fund. Milena, you've been a regular at the Social Outcome Conference. We make you work so hard every year. We're delighted to have you here. And Milena is joined by her colleague, Juanita, as well. Welcome, Juanita. And online, joining us all the way from Australia, we have three incredible speakers, and I'm so grateful to them that they've agreed to join, not least because they've had to beat the bureaucracy within the Australian government just to be able to join us on Zoom. So Lucy, David, and Judy, I can't see Judy on the many screens in front of me, but if you're there, I can see Lucy waving at us, lovely, and David. Can I just quickly ask you to unmute yourselves to say hi, just to make sure that we can hear you?
Sounds great. Hi, everyone. I'm Lucy from the Commonwealth Department of Treasury in Australia.
Thank you, Lucy. And David?
Yeah, thanks, Lucy, and thank you. I'm David from the Department of Social Services in Australia, and I would like to just briefly let you know that we may not have Judy, who's able to join us due to a very late power failure.
Well, we're delighted to have you both. So Lucy and David are joining us from the Australian government, and they've both been working on the Commonwealth Outcome Fund in Australia. So we're really excited to hear more about this new outcome fund in due course. So if we can quickly just move to the next slide, just so you have a sense as to what to expect from today's session. We're going to kick off with some brief presentations from our panelists, and that will include multiple points where we'll stop stop to hear your reflections. And then part 2, we're hoping to spend more time in an open discussion. We've put here on the slide some of the things that we hope to focus on, but really this is your session and your opportunity to bring to our panelists your burning questions. So without further ado, and to break the ice, I thought we'd kick off with a little Slido. Please do scan the QR code that you can see on this slide, or follow the link that I'm sure Emily or John will share in the chat, or maybe they've already done it. And there should be one simple question for you in the chat. And actually, John, if we go to the next slide, I think that has a question. There you go. So just to make sure we frame the discussion at the right level, we're really keen to know, those of you here in the room in Oxford, those of you online, what is your level of expertise or knowledge when it comes to outcome funds? And don't be humble. I think some of you might be tempted to say, well, I've worked on outcome funds for 5 years. I'm a novice. No, that is not a novice. We'll give everyone maybe 1 minute, and then Emily will share her screen so we can see the results. And if the Slido gods are not on our side, then we'll move on and come back to that in a moment. Oh, there you go. Fantastic. Oh, that's it. That's not helpful for our panelists. So if for whatever reason you can't see the slide with the responses, so about 40% have said they're got intermediate knowledge, some awareness of outcome funds, but looking for a deeper understanding. And actually interesting, quite a few people who said they're novices, so they're new to outcome funds and curious to understand the practice to date, and quite a few pros as well, which is excellent. So I'm sure there's going to be a lot of helpful stuff for everyone. We will probably go quite deep, but not so deep that you're going to feel confused. And actually, I've invited Elle to talk us through the basics, just for those of you who are novices or maybe need a reminder, or maybe you thought you knew what outcome funds are and you'll be surprised to hear that perhaps they're not. So Elle, can I come to you first?
Yeah, sure. I'm really glad we're having this session because in our experience, outcomes funds have been a really crucial catalyst to the development of many outcomes-based partnerships and outcomes-based contracts. So just wanted to start with a definition, but hopefully not one of those sort of narrow, snooty academic definitions, but just a kind of definition to ground our conversation today and check that we're all talking at least roughly about the same thing when it comes to outcome funds, because there isn't really a standard definition as to what constitutes an outcomes fund. In our work, we take quite a broad understanding. So we think about an outcomes fund as an approach that enables several outcome-based contracts to be grouped in a portfolio, to be developed and supported either in parallel or in very quick succession. And we see 3 key characteristics. So there's dedicated funding to pay for social outcomes. This is cash to pay for outcomes. We're not talking about the investment piece here. There's the intention to issue multiple separate outcome-based contracts, bigger than a SIB, more than one SIB at least. And thirdly, that it's open to the involvement of impact investments, but we don't make this a requirement for outcomes funds. So that kind of working capital availability of third-party investment, we don't make essential to an outcomes fund criteria, but it's in the mix, shall we say. But I think the most crucial thing is this is dedicated funding to pay for measurable outcomes, social outcomes, environmental outcomes. We have got a couple of resources that I also just wanted to flag. We think that there's several outcomes funds out there. We've counted at least 21 to date, and our Indigo Data Collaborative is a place that is compiling some information to just describe these different outcome funds and link them through to the outcome-based contracts or projects, the results. So we have a data set called the Outcomes Fund Directory. If you're interested in understanding the other outcome funds that are out there, that's a resource that you can use just to help navigate and understand those other outcome funds. And we also have a practitioner guide that just sets out some of the kind of preliminaries of outcome funds. That's very much the foundations in terms of how we have understood them. But what I would say is there are many different flavors of outcomes funds. Some of them are unilateral and are outright paying for outcomes independently. Others are co-payers for outcomes working with others. Sometimes this is driven within governments. Sometimes outcome funds are hosted in other institutions, and we'll hear about more of that. So I just want to say this is our kind of overarching framework, and we'll get into more of the different flavors. And I know that Neil will talk a bit more about that.
Excellent, thank you, Elle. And yeah, Neil, we'll come to you next to hear about the flavor of outcome funds in the UK. Before we do that, though, just to make sure we take everyone from novice to intermediate, I just want to pause for 1 or 2 minutes to see if there are any questions, sort of point of clarification around the basics of outcome funds that Elle can clarify for us. So feel free to put your hand up, or John, let me know if there are any questions on Zoom. No, well, that was a brilliant synthesis. Elle, thank you very much. So over to you, Neil.
So we're going to start with another slide, though, I think.
Yes,
So whether you're a novice or intermediate or advanced, it'd be useful if you could try and think of at least one advantage or one disadvantage of an outcomes fund approach, potentially.
And then Neil will tell you the correct answer.
There is no correct answer.
Let's give everyone a
This is cloud, not clock. I'll give you a minute to do that. But we will come back to it again. I will tell you what I think of some of the advantages and disadvantages.
And Lucy and David, feel free to add your own reflections in the Slido survey.
Okay. So we got scale, efficiency. Got me not fast enough, I can read it. Greater capital, risk diversification, lowering transaction costs. Can lead to gaming.
Lower cost outcomes.
Flexibility, downside. How can we? Yeah. So it's interesting. So I would say some of those are advantages and disadvantages of social outcomes partnerships and contracts per se, rather than the funds. Some of them definitely are advantages and disadvantages of doing it this way. Okay, we might come back to that at the end, but let's see. So next slide, please. Or first slide. So this slide is a rough overview of and timeline for the outcomes funds on the definition Elle given you in the UK. I'm happy with that definition. What's interesting, one thing that's interesting, I think some of these funds did mandate social investment. They did require investment, and others didn't. And one of the issues we'll come back to at the end is whether the rules that are different for each fund is part of the issue. But so 5, 6, 7, 8. So of the 21 worldwide, 10 have been in the UK. I think we probably had the first one. The first one is the Innovation Fund. There were actually 2 of those, so you could argue there's another fund there, from the Department for Work and Pension. Apologies for all the acronyms. The slide wouldn't work if I put them all in full. The main thing I wanted to emphasise on that slide is that in the UK, they've all been funded by government or agencies closely aligned to government. So they've all been funded by a government department, except the Commissioning Better Outcomes Fund, which is funded by the National Lottery Community Fund. And talking to Sue from that fund yesterday, we say, is that part of government or not? It very much likes to say it's not, but it's spending money in a way that's quite aligned with government in some ways. And the other one is the GLA, roughly. GLA is the Greater London Authority, which was headed at the time by a chap called Boris Johnson. So he's actually knows more about SIPs than he does about just about anything else. The other thing I'd like to I've highlighted two different types. So the ones in orange are what Elle described as the ones that are 100% funding. And the ones in purple are what we sometimes call top-up, or I think a better term is co-commissioning funds. And I want to say a little bit more about that. So if we could move on to the next slide. So we broadly had two, and as Elle rightly said, there's an awful lot of nuance here, and the taxonomy is different, and GoLab had done some great work on this. But simplistically, I think of them as two types of fund. So the ones that have been led by policy and by a government department or an agency who have said, we want to put money into solving this problem. They've been developed centrally by the government. They pay for all the outcomes, and therefore a defined policy objective. So the very first one was addressing people who are long-term not in employment, education and training. The most recent one, the Refugee Transitions Fund in the Home Office, was addressing specific needs of refugees, but funnily enough was also addressing EAT outcomes for the same cohort. Others have looked at rough sleeping, and similar issues. And Andy Burnham, who's speaking at the end of today, made very good use of those in Greater Manchester. They funded about a third, just over a third of, I counted 93. I'm slightly horrified to realize you've got to 99 in the report when we published it yesterday. But up to the end of 23, we counted 93. So 37 of those were funded by that. And the top-up funds, the co-commissioning funds, which I think have done the rest, and they've done quite a bit more. And they're very different. They pay for part of the outcomes, often this part of the same outcome, or sometimes different outcomes. But the big difference is they're encouraging local bottom-up development of SIBs and SOCs rather than a top-down approach. I mean, again, that's a nuance. The 100% funding ones have had a lot of local development and involvement, but they're not as local. And they're very much led by local priorities. They're very much specific designs and there's a big difference in the outcomes and rate cards. So I think all the central funds said, this is what we will pay for, and this is how much we will pay. One or two allowed discretion around the edges of that, but they all were quite specific. Whereas the local fund said, you can design what it is you want to pay for, how you want to construct it, and all those issues that we've been talking about at GoLab for 10 years. So that's the difference. Personally, I've been involved in both types of fund as an evaluator and as an advisor on the design of them. The one I know most about, and we're going to move on to and talk about a bit more depth, is the Commissioning Better Outcomes Fund, which is the first to really take off, I think, as a local top-up fund. And you were very kind to call me a leading light in this, but I think I take second place to Ecoris, and James Ronicle from Ecoris is online, and they led the evaluation of the CBO and two others that I've been involved in. So he really deserves more of the credit than I do. But let's move on. We'll talk a bit about the Commissioning Better Outcomes Fund. So there's a bit of a case study. We're getting to the end of this. It's been longitudinal evaluation that started at the beginning of 2014, so more than 10 years. And the programme, on our figures in the final report, which we're working on at the moment, has done this. It has funded 62 development grants, which I'll talk a bit about in a sec, and co-funded 25 projects. Actually, it has subsequently funded a couple more, but the ones that we've evaluated is 25. I say that because everyone's saying, I don't get that number, I get a different number, but let's not worry about that today. And the evaluation which Ecoris and ourselves from ATQ have been running, which is centred on 9 in-depth reviews. The thing that's important to point out there is the development grants. So before the CBO, we did have the Social Outcomes Fund, which Nick Hurd was talking about at the launch of the report last night. And that came from the Cabinet Office. Now DCMS have the responsibility for it. But interestingly, that did not give grants to local organisations to help them develop the projects. And partly for that reason, it never really took off. I think it's fair to say that. So the development grants are quite an important part of this. And it's interesting to see the difference. So there are 60 development grants and 25, some respects 28 projects that were funded. So there were a lot of development grants for projects that didn't get off the ground. But actually, as evaluators, we think that's a good thing. The whole point was to try things out. And this is very much cloud territory. The cloud clocks analogy we got yesterday is going to stick with me for a long time. We're in cloud territory here, and there was a lot of things, people saying, we want to try this, we want to see if that will work. So a lot of development grants were done. And development grants were extended into the Life Chances Fund, but were lower. Sorry.
Just on development grants, can you give us a flavour of the size of these grants?
Well, that's an interesting point. The maximum grant under the CBO was 150,000. Under the, I don't know what it was under Life Chances Fund, but I know it was a lot lower. And there was some feedback, and I was involved in that, and a number says that 150 was too high. We didn't think they needed that much money. There were an awful lot of applications for 149,900. They could be used for help to bring in advisors, to bring in project management, but a lot of it was to pay for people in-house to actually put time into the development of these. So yeah, I think the average is about 80K for that. And ATQ never got more than 66. So since the consultants were getting a bit of a bad press at times, we think we're quite efficient in the way we use. Can you hit the... Oh, thank you. So these are some preliminary findings. I have to emphasise we haven't finished this evaluation. These figures may change, but this is what it's achieved. I don't want to go into our definitions here, or I would use all my time and a lot more, but all the projects had to do a median plan, a kind of base case, which was signed off by the National Lottery Community Fund when they gave them co-commissioning funding. And we've used that as a benchmark for how successful the projects were. Clearly, that's not a perfect measure because it was self-set by the projects, and some of them were very challenging on themselves, some arguably less so. But interesting, one of our overall findings is there was more optimism bias than anything else in a lot of the projects. So it's a reasonable measure. They've done quite well considering some of the challenges they set themselves. So we've got 46,000 users engaged, 80,000 outcomes paid, which was 83% of plan. And the amount paid for the outcomes was higher. The reason that was higher, interestingly, is because the community fund were very flexible in increasing payments in some respects, particularly during COVID when things got sticky for a lot of these projects. So they would tend to modify some of the outcome measures at times. Quite a few of the projects got changed partway through to increase the payments. And something that's interesting in the context of the debate there's been about investment is that overall, across the projects, almost exactly investors got their capital back, their principal, but no return. So the money multiple was almost exactly 1, which we find interesting I find interesting when I hear the stories of how investors have gouged the market and they're making huge returns. They're not. They promised relatively low returns and they got relatively low returns. Though clearly there's a lot of variation on individual projects. The other thing I wanted to highlight is the legacy of the programme, because it was at the forefront and it was trying things that had never been done. We were talking about health projects yesterday, and it did the very first health project, Ways to Wellness in Newcastle, claims to be the first, and I think it is. And there were some others like the Mental Health and Employment Partnership, the very first one. So you can just press the button again for me. Oh, thank you. So of the 9 projects we've studied in depth, 5 have been recommissioned in some form. Across the 25, I can't remember the figure, but it's similar, more than half of them. But there's some very strong wider legacy, which I think is important, and was highlighted in some of the essays in the report as published yesterday. So my favourite of all the projects, and the one I evaluated 3 times, and Alec Fraser, who's in the room, has evaluated separately from King's, the Zero HIV SIB in South London, trying a different approach, trying an outcomes approach to testing people for HIV, which led to, was pretty important in the NHS committing 180 million to rolling out widespread HIV testing. We heard about mental health employment partnership. If you came to this session yesterday on health, I mean, IPS as an intervention is now the government's go-to intervention, really, for those with mental health and wider health issues who need to be put into work. And I think we'll hear quite a bit more about that in the next few years. And the other really notable achievement of this program, I think, is the end-of-life care integrator projects. Not all of those projects were themselves fantastically successful, but the learning from it was such that Macmillan Cancer have put 36 million into their own repayable finance fund. So when people say we're not getting as many SIBs as we used to, it depends how you define that, because Macmillan are putting money into projects that are based on investment and repayable finance and pay for outcomes. So in some respects, they meet that definition. And there's more, but I'll move on because we haven't got time. So here's both the problem and the opportunity. So if you come back to that chart and press the button again, no, the other way. That shows the build up to 93 SIBs by 2023, SIBs and SOC. So perhaps slightly unsurprisingly, we had one SIB, and guess which was that? It was somewhere, Peterborough, was it? I think, right at the very beginning. Although, to be fair, Peterborough was part funded by the National Lottery Community Fund, so it's kind of a one-off outcomes fund. But you can see very clearly how it accelerated massively, the number, and then it tails off. When we were doing our final round of interviews with key stakeholders for the CBO, a lot of people said that we were in a trough, we were in a plateau. And it can't be coincidence that as the funds have stopped, the SIBs have stopped. It's not completely true that they stopped. There are quite a few still out there, and there are people extending ones. I've been involved in helping people extend existing projects. West London Zone have rebadged and have won new projects. People are doing it, but the real drive for these innovative projects has kind of leveled off quite a lot. So finally, just a couple of reflections from me on what I would see the advantages. So if you think SOCs and SIBs are a good thing, somebody on another slide, yesterday put up, SIBs don't work. So, okay. If you think they work, if you think they have benefits, the benefits we've been discussing for 8 years in this room and others, then clearly they're of massive benefit because they directly encourage them, they directly promote them. If you don't think they're a good thing, then they're skewing the market in favor, they're skewing the commissioning landscape in terms of one type of intervention over another because people will follow the money. So those balance out, it's a point of view. But I think there are two really great advantages, particularly for the co-commissioning funds. One is they've really encouraged entrepreneurship, something else I heard being talked about yesterday, people to try new things. We wouldn't have got to this. If you look at the progression of just rate cards, for instance, if you look at the way that people tried things in some of the early SIBs, and then by the time you get to KBOP, you've got a very complex, long, quite sophisticated rate card that is thought from and learnt from a lot of other projects. And the thing I like most, frankly, because I think value for money is important, you get a lot of bang for your buck. You're giving 15 to 30%, and the rest is local funding. So they've been quite instrumental and in doing that. And I think they help people to take that risk, to do that innovative thing, even if they pay for themselves. And some of them have paid for themselves without, but I think it just helps people do that. On the other side, I'll come back to the second bullet though, because I think I'll put that at the bottom. They do encourage, some of the stakeholders we've spoken to, it's time these things stood on their own 2 feet. It's time that if people wanted to do a social outcomes contract, they did it and did it with their own money. Well, some have. As I say, it's risky, it's challenging. They won't innovate as much if you do that. They will just do the things that already work. And there isn't much else. I mean, the interventions that are funded through social outcomes contracts generally get funded by government. They're not things that are going to get done without specific funding in many cases. And they can blur accountability. We often say that there are three people, at least, in three key stakeholders in any SOC, which is the provider, the commissioner, and the investor or their representative. In some of these funds, in fact, most of these funds, there's a fourth party in the room, which is the person doing the co-commissioning or the funding. And I've seen, and certainly in some of the ones I've evaluated, the central funds, you can see some blurring there. So whose job is that? When COVID hit, some that were being done by Department for Education at care leavers that I was involved in evaluating, people say, whose job is it to sort that out? Is it the local commissioner? I said, well, they're not the funder. So if you're going to change the funding model, you've got to talk to the department. So it became quite complex. And the thing I come back to, I think every single one of those funds had a different set of rules. Some of them mandated social investment, some of them allowed providers to be co-investors, have skin in the game. Others didn't allow providers to do that. CBO allowed outcomes that were not SIBs. LCF was a bit more restrictive in that. And the consistent feedback we've had from all the stakeholders, and I've been a stakeholder myself in some of that, I would say that isn't helpful. I think if you're designing an outcome fund, obviously you need to protect people, protect the public purse, and have some minimum constraints in place. But I would argue for fewer rules.
Thank you, Neil. And yeah, I'm curious to see on Slido if people have changed their mind as to the potential benefits and disadvantages. And I hope we'll get to come back to this question of potential benefits and disadvantages to hear from Australian government colleagues and from the Education Outcome Fund. I have just a quick question for you, Neil. What's your view when you've discussed some of the disadvantages? Do you think that those are inherent in the kind of outcome fund model, or there design choices that were made and that we can potentially, approach in a different way with future outcome funds?
That's a great question. I think the risk of the blurring of accountability, that there's a funder and a different outcomes payer, is inherent in some of them. You couldn't solve it, but you could deal with it in different ways and make it clearer. It was partly, I think, frankly, immaturity on the part of some parties who think, well, we're doing this, but we haven't thought about the fact that by being the funder and the one who sets the rate card, we're taking away the local commissioners. The local commissioner is effectively just a pass-through. But on the simplification point, that's definitely a design choice.
Okay,
yes.
Brilliant. Did you want to come in, Elle? No, great. Well, I think that's a great point to move on to colleagues at the Education Outcome Fund, and then the Australian government is pointing about the sort of evolution of the learning. And okay, we've started with outcome funds in the UK. We've had 10 so far. So by this point, you'd expect outcome funds in new places to build on the learning that's been generated, although recognizing that obviously different contexts will be very different.
Sorry, I forgot to say what I should have said, and I meant to put on one. From the CBO, there was the National Lottery Community Fund deliberately set it up as a learning fund, and there was a massive strand of the evaluation about learning. And I should have mentioned the amount that was learned from it was fantastic, and we put a lot of effort into trying to get that learning out and feed it into the LCF and other things.
I think that's a great point, Neil, and I think it's been similarly with the Life Chances Fund. So I think across the two funds, we've been really privileged to be able to put out in the public domain knowledge that lots of other organizations can learn from. And actually, that's been brilliant with the Education Outcome Fund. And Milena, I remember discussions we were having a few years ago, and we were saying, learning, think about it early on, evaluation, and you guys have done that brilliantly. So I'd love, maybe we can start with you, Milena, and then we'll come to Juanita. What flavor outcome funds do you lead at the Education Outcome Funds, and have you borrowed any ingredients from the UK cookbook?
Thank you. And I'm very glad you keep inviting me to speak at the National Outcomes Conference, but especially for this session, because Outcomes Funds is really what we do at EOF. So very happy to share our experience. The Education Outcomes Fund is a UNICEF-hosted fund, and we were created to leverage outcomes-based partnerships to improve learning and employment outcomes for children and young people. And to date, we have launched 2 of the largest outcomes funds in education worldwide, so 2 of the 21. And they've been designed in partnership with the governments of Ghana and Sierra Leone, and supported by UK International Aid, the governments themselves that are co-funding the programs, and a few other funders. And they're really large-scale outcomes funds for the development sector. So we're reaching over 130,000 children in Sierra Leone, and close to 200,000 children in Ghana. And they're focusing on learning outcome in literacy and numeracy, so in basic education. But more recently, we've also been working on the next wave of programs, and we're expecting to launch between end of this year and next year 4 more outcomes funds in early childhood care and education that our colleague Gazelle was speaking about yesterday, and also in the skills for employment sector. And so that will be in Sierra Leone, Rwanda, South Africa, and Tunisia. So I think we're at a really interesting point in our journey where we're now are getting a lot of lessons learned from the implementation of these first outcomes funds. And so we've been doing a lot of internal reflections, and I want to share today some of these thoughts. But this is very much an ongoing process because learning is this continuous journey. So, maybe next year when we chat again, I'll have other thoughts and kind of more to share on that. I think it's important maybe to clarify, I guess, especially for those that are more the novice in the room, the way we're doing, because outcomes funds are such a broad definition, they can be done in very different way. And it was interesting to hear the reflections on benefits and disadvantage in the UK. Some of these definitely resonate. Some of these perhaps are a little bit different due to the way outcomes funds have been thought about in the UK versus internationally. So this kind of difference between local and central commissioning and outcomes funds being, a tool to encourage social outcomes contract is perhaps quite UK specific, I would say, in the way we've been operating in low and middle income countries. The outcomes fund is the umbrella within which we have the different social outcomes contract rather than something that encourages it, if that makes sense. But happy to answer more questions to clarify that later. I think the overarching kind of reflection around outcomes funds can take multiple shapes and forms. I think we fully agree with that. We did learn a lot from the UK experience when we set up EOF. And so some of the way we've been thinking about it was very, very much influenced by the UK experience, and some of the choices we made were a bit different. But I think in any case, there's a lot of choices to be made by practitioners thinking about what you're trying to achieve. So maybe I'll share like a few thoughts on maybe 4 or 5 points where our thinking has evolved particularly, and thought would be interesting for the audience. The first one, and it's interesting, it came up in the Slido quite a lot, is the point of scale. So outcomes funds we see at EOF as a really interesting instrument to achieve greater scale. And there's different reasons why this is important. I mean, first, because we really need to get to a greater scale of impact. So, particularly where in our sector in education, when we look at the learning crisis and the fact that 7 out of 10 children at age 10 are not able to read with understanding. Like, it is time to really use these instruments to achieve greater impact. And we've done enough pilots now to be able to move to that next stage. So that's one, but obviously also was mentioned in the Slido, the point around reducing transaction cost and using outcomes funds as a way to streamline contracting and reduce transaction costs, we definitely think is critical. And finally, one thing that at EOF we've been really interested in is using outcomes funds to contract multiple implementers. And that has allowed us to test variety of interventions, whether it's about teaching at the right level or using focus on social emotional skills as a way to achieve greater literacy and numeracy. That's really what's so rich about outcomes funds as well, this diversity of contracts, and also allowing us to test different kind of managerial practices and organizations, some of which will inherently do better than others, right? and to learn from that. So the scale point is really critical, and that's one thing where we've really remained kind of steady in our commitment.
Just a point of clarification, because obviously we talk a lot about scale at this conference, and we also have a panel later this evening with Amel around institutionalizing outcomes more generally. So when you say we want to use outcome funds as an instrument to achieve scale, is that in terms of the amount of funding that's going into particular learning outcomes being achieved? Is it about the number of projects, size of that projects, number of providers you work with on the ground, all of the above?
I think it's both, actually, yeah, because definitely on the funding side, and you know, the point around transaction costs, for example, is only valid like once you get to a certain scale, because actually the design cost and a lot of the management cost of the outcomes funds remain quite constant, right? So the greater the scale in terms of funding, the greater the value for money, and the lower the transaction cost. And I think that's a key part of it. And to really be able to test interventions at scale and not just in a small pilot, because what works for 5 schools might not work for, you know, 1,500 and, you know, like nationwide. Then on the intervention side, the scale is also really interesting because it's what allows us to contract different providers. So Juanita will tell you more about our program in Sierra Leone, the Sierra Leone Education Innovation Challenge, where we have 5 different implementing partners. And that's how we can learn from what works, right? By testing different interventions. And so for governments to want to engage in outcomes funds, it's been a really key driver, this opportunity to test different interventions.
Thank you.
Now, a few points maybe where we've kind of, our thinking has evolved and is still kind of really very much evolving at the moment. So Juanita will tell you a lot more about the questions around setup, structure. I think there's a lot of reflections on that. And one key question that we often get is, but is it better to have them centrally managed by government or managed by an intermediary? And kind of recognizing that trade-off between the potential for longer term sustainability when it's fully embedded within government, but on the other hand, you know, recognizing that for government, you know, to have the required systems in place and capacity to do that is very challenging, and that therefore using sometimes an intermediary can be a great way to position them for success for a first experience. So there's a lot of kind of, you know, trade-offs to be made, and we've also done a lot of thinking on governance, and Juanita will also share a lot more examples on that, on what is the right kind of way to engage all of these different actors in an outcomes fund. So I'll let her to speak more about that. Wanted to speak perhaps a little bit about the role of the investor. And it was interesting that, Elle, you were talking about the fact that you're not requiring in your definition of outcomes fund the presence of an investor. And we at AOF took the same view, that we did not want to require the presence of an investor if it was not needed. So if providers are able to self-fund, then we thought that would be perfectly fine. I think we're reflecting on that. And on one hand, we haven't changed our course, at least not yet. But we're also starting to realize that for providers to take on that risk, it is quite a lot for them, and they need to be fully cognizant of the risk that they're taking, but also that they are not benefiting from the support that the investor is going to provide, you know, on an ongoing basis. And so we've been, you know, having more discussions as well. Like, yeah, we had a really interesting discussion yesterday with Bridges Outcomes Partnership, and thinking around, you know, what is the best role for all of us to play? How do we avoid duplication, etc. Then, yeah, maybe one last point then on something that we've been doing a lot of thinking about, and I think was interesting as well in the context of the UK is coming up as well, is this question of complexity. That's definitely a bit of a challenge for us. And, you know, when we were designing these programs, I think we have very, very smart technical teams at AOF that love working on the design of these programs, and really go quite far in thinking, what are the right incentives we want to create? How do we avoid perverse incentives? And all of that is incredibly valuable. But on the downside, you risk having very complex designs and programs. And then the reality kicks in, and you start seeing how the program is being implemented in rural Sierra Leone, in Kenema, by a local organization, and how do you explain to them that design, right? And so I think we've kind of like maybe realized that there was a lot of value in kind of simplifying and trying to really stay core to fewer perhaps design choices. One interesting example is in our Sierra Leone program, we've got two main metrics. One is around the kind of learning gains in literacy and numeracy, and we're using an RCT to pay for that. But then we also have a second metric around the proportion of children achieving certain thresholds in literacy and numeracy. And that was something that the government was quite keen about because they wanted to know how children are doing on these thresholds. But on the other hand, it's complicating things further, right? And I think a lot of the providers haven't necessarily fully understood how this works, and therefore it's not really driving their behavior that effectively. So I think that's still an ongoing questioning around how can we set the right incentives, mitigate perverse incentives without overcomplexifying. So,
Brilliant, thank you. Juanita, I'll come with you to you next, but I think Milena, I really feel like the Education Outcome Fund deserves a lot of praise, for the robustness of the approach you've chosen to take to the whole, not just evaluation, but learning agenda within your funds, within EOF as an organization. And then we heard a lot about that yesterday from Moselle, but also in terms of sharing that really openly. So I think the fact that you've been coming here to the Social Outcome Conference year on year, and you're saying, well, this year, right now, here are my lessons or learning, but actually by next year maybe our understanding would have changed. I think that's quite brave, and I think, you know, we've seen it a bit as evaluators where you almost like want to wait until the end to be able to say with certainty this is the lesson, whereas I think it's really exciting that you've shared the learning really generously with the field, and hopefully for others maybe working on new outcome funds, I hope they're taking all that learning on board. So I do think that's really remarkable. And on that, one of the things that I thought it's really interesting, and that is that you guys have done a lot of internal reflection about your own role as EOF, as the intermediary in this. And on that, Juanita, I know you're going to tell us more about that.
Yeah, well, thank you. So yeah, I'm going to talk more about our role and the governance as a whole. So how does our role fit sort of like with all the different actors in outcomes funds? So we've had sort of like the opportunity to play two very different roles in our two programs. So in our program in Sierra Leone, the one I'm very involved in, we have a very much like the traditional intermediary sort of role. And we do most of the management of the program on a daily basis. But then on Ghana, on the other hand, we have more of an advisory type of role on the specific OBF aspect, and most of the management is handled inside the government. And that's been super interesting because then we can learn from both approaches, and we can see sort of like what are we gaining from one and what are the trade-offs with the other, and then we can evolve and learn our thinking. So Milena touched already a bit on these trade-offs that exist. So we've been reflecting on what's the sort of like value add of these sort of bigger intermediary role. And reflecting, yeah, we've seen that, you know, outcome funds were created from impact bonds to try to reduce transactional costs, to try to make them sort of more efficient, ease the burden on donors and governments at times. And we've definitely seen those benefits. But the bigger benefit we've seen is really especially in the governments we're working with, where there's not yet the capacities to deal with the day-to-day sort of challenges that an outcome fund come with, really have the dedicated capacity to think about it, to make sure that all decisions and all the actions keep in mind and are embedded into this sort of like OBF mindset, right? That we don't move away from that intent and that OBF effect. So we've seen great benefits in that, but then sort of there's always another side of the coin. So what's the trade-off? Us being very involved in the day-to-day management then gives space to the government to maybe be able to take a step back and be potentially less involved, have less ownership of the program because we know we have it handled, right? We don't need to solve this because someone else is going to solve it. And they're very stretched usually, so they appreciate that quite a bit. And then what are the implications for that, right? Like sustainability, for example, it's a big question. Like if they are not in the day-to-day, then how are they going to sustain the impact maybe after this program is over? How are they going to get the capacities, you know, to maybe do this in the future and embed in the way they fund their own programs if they're not in the sort of like day-to-day management? And there's a lot of questions at the time, not a lot of answers. I hope that in some years we're going to have more clear answer on how to achieve sort of that balance. But that definitely raises a big question of how do we still take that benefit of an intermediary that supports this process and makes it smooth, but we still give that ownership to the government. And then there's another question, should we leverage other actors to take maybe other roles to also strengthen more the system, as opposed to the intermediary sort of monopolizing a lot of those roles. I'm going to go quickly to, besides sort of like the daily management that I've talked about, to other 3 key roles, and I'm going to pose more questions than answers, unfortunately, but for us to maybe start reflecting on, and we can take on a bit more and discuss after. But for example, there is this thing that comes out quite a bit on implementation and are more like systemic challenges that providers deal with on a day-to-day basis. So to give you an example, teachers are not getting paid on time. The supplies of the government to the schools are not arriving on time. That affects results, but providers don't have control over that, right? And they're ultimately the ones incentivized to achieve results. So how do you deal with that? Like, should the intermediary be the one sort of facilitating that, liaising with the government and making sure that we can solve this to provide the best ecosystem for grantees to achieve results? Or should the government be taking them themselves and sort of connecting directly with the investors and with the service providers on this? We've seen benefits from both sides. In Sierra Leone, it's mostly through us. And we've seen how that can allow for a more structured, collaborative effort among the challenges from all the grantees, from 5 of them, and go, with more clear requests to the government. But we've also seen the benefits on Ghana, in which, there's sometimes a bit more clear response and more efficient response from the government because they feel more ownership over the same program. Performance management, who should be doing that? Should be that fully should be fully on the grantees and the investors to do that, or should the intermediary facilitate that learning process and that like iterative process? And then the evaluation management. Should the evaluation be managed and overseen by the intermediary or even the government, or is there even an alternative for the evaluation to have their own seat or bigger seat in the governance? Again, a lot of questions, not a lot of answers yet. But I think reflecting on all of these roles, something that is quite clear, and it's been quite clear to us throughout the program, is that beyond just defining specific roles, what's quite magical is how you bring all of those roles together. We were talking about yesterday about sort of like these relational contracts. How do you create this partnership among these different partners, regardless of what their role is, right? And there's 4 principles I want to touch on quickly that we find quite key. The first 2 are transparency and accountability. Making sure that decisions are made in a transparent way, everyone understands why decisions are being made, and they're accountable to that decisions are with the intent of the ultimate goal of the program is quite important. And I always think about it like this weird example, but when I was a kid, and my parents told me I couldn't go to a party, and I would be like, why not? And they said, because I say no. And they never gave me an explanation. I'd be like, if you maybe give me an explanation, I would buy in. And maybe, it would make sense, and then it would be fine. But when you don't tell me the reason, it just feels like we're against each other. The second one is inclusivity. Bringing everyone's perspectives into the table. And don't exclude anyone. Everyone has something very interesting to bring, and everyone has a very important perspective. So thinking about yesterday, beyond the cloud and clock that we learned about, something that Tina mentioned that really struck with me was this difference between positions and interest. In this outcome funds, there's a lot of different positions, but there's a common interest. Achieving outcomes, generating evidence, learning. We all agree on those, but there's different positions. How do you bring all of them together to the table? And then making sure that what comes to the surface with the decisions being made is that interest. And to give you an example, in the Sierra Leonean program, we have to deal with other interventions happening on the ground besides our own program. And there's very different positions around this. So the evaluator on one hand is like, this is a problem, we're doing an impact evaluation, this is going to affect our results, it's going to contaminate our results, a lot of these technical conversations. On the other hand, we have the government who has a completely different position and comes and says, yeah, but how am I going to not give the opportunity to children to have more access to better resources to learn more and better? That's what these interventions are bringing, especially in control schools, right? And then the grantees have a completely different position from their practical point of view on now I need to coordinate with these other interventions. Now I need to harmonize. Now I need to, what if what they're teaching is like contradictory to what I'm teaching? So a lot of discussions happened. I'm not going to go into the details of the strategies, but it was a very interesting process of, okay, we need to take all these different positions, bring them to that, what is the objective at the end? Children learning more and better, and create generating evidence. So how can we still allow these interventions, but sort of harmonize, making sure that the evaluation is not affected, making sure that the grantees have a good environment to collaborate with these other interventions and to find themselves to be complementaries as opposed to sort of opposition. And then the last one very quickly, because I know we're running out of time, is flexibility. That's key in governance. OBF by its own nature is very flexible. So the structures around OBF need to be flexible too. And just having a governance structure and saying we're going to go with that for 3 years no matter what, it's going to avoid that its own sort of like evolving nature of it. Relationships evolve, needs evolve, and we need to adapt to those if we want to achieve our ultimate goal. Mary, one quick example on that is when we started our governance, we had a forum that we had dedicated for implementing partners to learn and problem solve, but we had one for both. And unfortunately, what was happening is that problem solving and decision making was taking precedent, and there was not enough time for learning, because that was more urgent, right? To problem solve specific issues and to come up with decisions. And learning seemed important, but less urgent. So at some point, we were having no space for learning. And we were really reflecting on that and like sort of being like, okay, what can we do? Because that's going to affect the long run a lot more than maybe this very specific decision that we made that was important at the time, but might not affect sort of like the whole ecosystem. So a lot of conversations with them, and the solution was very simple and quite a game changer. Let's just divide the spaces, and let's have two completely separate spaces, one dedicated for learning that was fully led and managed by the ones who are learning, and one dedicated for problem solving, in which we bring government into the table to really help into this process. So yeah, I mean, that's like in a nutshell a bit what we've learned. Again, more questions than answers, but definitely a lot of a very interesting journey that we're going through.
Thank you so much, Juanita. No, that was absolutely brilliant. You gave us lots of questions, but I think also some really clear answers, or at least like ingredients: transparency and accountability, inclusivity, flexibility, that space for learning. And I guess for me, one of the most exciting things to hear from you is this really deliberate approach to ecosystem building. It's not just about kind of getting projects over the line, hitting the results that we want to see. That's obviously also really important, but doing it in a sustainable way. Wonderful. We're going to skip the next Slido question. Maybe we can just share it on Zoom, or if you have Slido open, you'll be able to see it. But I know Lucy and Judy. Hello, Judy. Glad to see that you've managed to overcome the power outage to be with us. I seem to have lost David, but I hope he's still around as well. And I have to admit, I've had to pull a few favors to get to Lucy and Judy and David, and then I implore them to join us on this panel, because we'd heard about the Commonwealth Outcome Fund, but I also felt like I don't know enough. And it's funny that we came to know about the Outcome Fund because we got a couple of requests to share information from various parts of the Australian government. So in a way, we were reassured that in the design of this new Outcome Fund, the Australian government was looking to learn from existing practice. And I know you spoke to lots of people. So we're really curious to find out what you got to, what the new Commonwealth Outcome Fund looks like, and what some of your learning has been so far.
Thank you, Andrea. Yes, for those that didn't know, I have been in a power outage, so I've just had my electricity come back on, so just in time. Can people hear me?
Yes, we can hear you and see you brilliantly.
Great. Okay, good. So I'm Judy, and I work in the Department of Social Services, which is one of the government departments in the Australian government. In our Commonwealth government, so we have a federated system, so we have state and territories and a federal government, and Lucy and I and David are from the federal government. We were just going to start just talking a little bit about the sort of the landscape in Australia. we feel that we're in a very nascent, we're just beginning, it's a small step, and we're just starting out in social impact investing and in outcomes-based contracting. So most of the work that has been done has been done in some of our state governments, and the first social impact bond that we had in Australia was actually released by one of our states, New South Wales, and that was back in 2013. Since then, we've had a number of SIBs launched, and we've got a number of payment by results or payment by outcome contracts in place between state governments, Commonwealth. So there's about 20 contracts, deals in place or finalised in Australia at the moment. So not a great deal. The first time the Commonwealth Government really expanded into social impact investing was with a fund called the CEDIF. So it was a Social Enterprise Development Investment Fund, and that was designed to support social enterprises. So there was funding available to set up with 3 intermediaries who would provide support and loans to social enterprises. 2 of those intermediaries or funds are still continuing now. And it was successful at the time, it was evaluated, and then not a lot more happened after that. And then really the next time the Commonwealth Government got started was in about 2017, where we started some trials. So they were done within our department, in the Department of Social Services, and there were really 2 sets of trials. One set was really focused on capability building, particularly of the social enterprise market. So we had what we call the Sector Readiness Fund, and that was grant funding that was available to social enterprises to support them in raising capital and becoming capital ready, to attract investment. And the other one was the Outcome Measurement Initiative, which was really about building capability of organisations to be able to measure their outcome and their impact. So they were the 2 sort of first capability building. Then we did a set of trials, which was our social impact investments. So we have 4 partnerships with state governments, and they're a mixture of SIBs and PBOs or payment by results, tending to be more in the children and families area, child protection, and some in employment. And then we did our own directly with service providers. So we have 3 payment by outcome trials. One is looking at employment through micro-enterprise. One is looking at school readiness for disadvantaged 3-year-olds. And the final one is looking at employment but utilising social enterprises through a sort of an aggregator model. And these are really just all trials to learn from them. I heard a little bit as my panel was going in and out, but some of those talked about transaction costs and stuff. For those 3 PBOs, we gave each organisation $200 Australian to support the development work and the transaction costs, and all 3 organisations said it was nowhere near enough. So it was interesting, the earlier speaker talking about the money that's required, and that probably reflected a lot that in Australia we didn't have, and we still need to develop the infrastructure and the granting mechanisms. There was a huge engagement from legal support for that. So we did have a lot of significant learnings from, and we still do, those trials are still ongoing, which we then have been able to feed into the outcome fund. But I'll pass on to Lucy, because it was around that time that we then had Australia develop a task force. And I'll pass to Lucy now. She can talk about the task force and the co-design of the outcomes fund.
Thanks. Thanks, Judy. So yeah, as you can see from the timeline and what Judy said, that, you know, there has been some progress, but we are still in our early days. Following all of the trials, we've sort of in 2019, the Australian government did establish a social impact investing task force to understand the gaps in the sector and the steps required to grow it. So in 2020, the expert panel, as part of the task force, delivered its final report, which was then updated in 2022 for the Australian government to consider. And in that final report, there were 4 key recommendations for the government to action to grow the market. So I'll just go through what they were. The first one was establish a Commonwealth Outcomes Fund to encourage a coordinated and cross-jurisdictional approach to outcomes-based funding. The second was establish a Commonwealth Office of Social Impact, which would be to coordinate and provide advice and expertise to inform social impact investment activity across all levels of government. The third was establishing an early stage social enterprise foundation to support flexible finance options for social enterprises. And the last recommendation was around establishing a social impact investing wholesaler in partnership with commercial investors. And this was to build a network of financial intermediaries to develop investment opportunities, as well as linking investors with opportunities. So as you can see from the timeline, the government did commit to establishing the Outcomes Fund in 2023 as the first step to build capability in the sector. And we'll go into more detail about the co-design and implementation in a moment. But in that same year, it also committed to establishing the Social Enterprise Development Initiative, which supports for-purpose organisations such as social enterprises and charities to build their capability to access capital and support improved social outcomes. So this one was to partially address the recommendation of a foundation and also, I guess, provide that in-step capability building while also learning through the Outcomes Fund in establishing it. So in this year, the Outcomes Fund will become operational, and Judy will talk more about that in a moment with projects to be selected. And in terms of the other 2 recommendations of the wholesaler and the office, the government will continue to consider that as the sector matures. So we'll go to the next slide, which is around the co-design process. So in August 2023, we embarked on a co-design process for the $100 million Outcomes Fund. And this was done in partnership between the Department of Social Services and Treasury. And we consulted over 100 stakeholders across the sector to develop the most appropriate model and build support for the fund, which, you know, all the speakers on the panel had mentioned. It's really important to get that buy-in. This included states and territory governments, investors, philanthropists, service providers, intermediaries, academics, and international experts for over the course of 8 months. And through the consultation process, we found a lot of opportunities as well as challenges when designing the fund. So I'll spend a little time talking through the key challenges and then the opportunities before I pass to Judy to talk about the final design of what we landed on and how we're implementing it. So in terms of challenges, Judy sort of mentioned at the beginning, Australia is a nascent market with very limited capability when it comes to social impact investing and outcomes-based contracting. A lot of capability building still needs to be done in order to deliver outcomes-based projects well. So the intermediary market is also relatively small, and there's very few service providers that have the experience to do outcomes-based contracting. And for the Australian government, doing outcomes-based contracting is really shifting away from our traditional models of funding, which is very grants-based. And this is fed into, I guess, our next sort of dot point, which is around being a federated model. So our constitution distributes power and responsibilities between a national government and 8 state and territory governments. This means that there's really distinct roles between and responsibilities between each level. So for example, as the federal government, we're responsible for things like defence, immigration, taxation, and some elements of healthcare, so aged care and disability care. but it's really the state and territory governments that are responsible for public housing, hospital, education, policing. And so because entrenched disadvantage, which is, I guess, the focus of our outcomes fund, or targeting it and tackling it, is very multifactorial in nature, this creates quite a few, I guess, tensions and challenges in terms of who's responsible for delivering the outcomes and who accrues the benefits of those outcomes. This is why, as part of the consultation process, we worked really closely with our state and territory counterparts to design the fund and seek their ideas for the projects. This means that, you know, it shares the responsibility both in funding arrangements as well as just the outcomes that we want to see delivered, as the state and territory governments are the sort of primary responsible entity for delivering them. In terms of the next one around differing levels of experience, it's not just around service providers or even the federal government, but across states and territories as well. As Judy mentioned, some of the states were one of the first to engage with outcomes-based contracting and have been doing it for many years and delivered some very successful projects, but there's definitely other state and territory governments that have limited or no experience at all in the space. So this can be a challenge in terms of selecting the projects, implementing them or scaling them to a national level. And then timeframes was one of the big ones that we faced in terms of getting feedback from stakeholders. Initially, when the government agreed to implement the Outcomes Fund, we were actually only looking at a 5-year timeframe, which I think everyone in the room would say is quite a short one. And so through the feedback of all of the key stakeholders, we understood that in order to measure and see tangible outcomes that in the long term, we would need to extend this timeframe, particularly when targeting sort of the more complicated forms of disadvantage. So that's why the final design we ended up extending to 10 years. And then the last key challenge, I guess, in the space when we were trying to design the Outcomes Fund is around the availability and access to data to develop the counterfactuals and for measuring outcomes to ensure we're actually able to see the difference the projects are making. There's quite a few elements to this challenge that we faced. First was around the availability of data, particularly sensitive personal data when we're trying to measure those outcomes. And then it came to, even if the right data was available, we needed to consider the access requirements, including legal obligations. And then the third element of that was the capacity of service providers delivering these projects and their ability to manage and report on the data as well. So taking on all of these sort of different elements when considering how we could actually design the Outcomes Fund. But on the flip side, there was definitely a lot of opportunities that this presented for us to test implementing an Outcomes Fund. So in the first instance, the fund would be able to change the way the Australian government and the broader industry would work together to bring innovation for better social outcomes. Outcomes-based contracting would enable us to target sort of more complex forms of disadvantage, bringing together wraparound services to address issues, and, you know, knowing that on-the-ground service providers are the ones who know best how to achieve outcomes for their clients. So that, you know, when we're paying for outcomes and not for outputs, we then also allow for that innovation to come through and for service delivery to do what works. This would then enable us to make sure that results weren't merely driven by outputs and deliver measurable outcomes for the people most in need. The Outcomes Fund was also that opportunity to build capability both in government and across the sector, enabling states and territories to become more familiar with outcomes-based funding. So, and it would also support service providers, including social enterprises, to access that funding that they really needed to grow their capability in delivering social services. So through the Outcomes Fund, and as my last point, we hope to shift the way that government funds social services in Australia in a fiscal ethically responsible and efficient way, so that it would enable the government to sort of test that scalability of programs, especially where they've already been successful and have a proven track record. So I'll pass back to Judy now to talk about the final design of our Outcomes Fund, its features, and how we landed after all of that consultation process.
Thanks, Lucy. Yeah, so the Outcome Fund is being delivered by Department of Social Services, and just looking at those challenges that we had, we looked at how we're going to address some of those. Apart from responding to recommendations from the Social Impact Investing Task Force, the Outcome Fund was also committed by the government as part of a Targeting Entrenched Disadvantage package, and that included a number of programs that was really looking at government doing things differently, and it was really around partnerships, strong partnerships. It also included place-based approaches and innovative funding models. So a big part of that was really around partnership across all governments and with communities and with philanthropy. So probably a fairly unique structure, or part of the structure of the Outcome Fund is partnerships with philanthropy, but I'll talk about that a little bit more. So yeah, as we said, we did manage to get the 10 years. The fund has been agreed to have 3 focus areas. So sometimes outcome funds are focused on one particular outcome or one particular area. It was eventually agreed that we would have three focus areas. Supporting positive outcomes for families and children, particularly around preventing the cycles of intergenerational and community disadvantage, overcoming barriers to employment and broadening opportunities to support people and communities facing unemployment through inclusive employment models, and supporting people facing and experiencing homelessness. But that's around the support services for homelessness, not the housing supply, which I'm sure is an issue all around the world and is definitely a huge issue in Australia for us. So in designing the fund and implementing the fund now, we agreed to have different expressions of interest situations. So the fund will partner with state and territory governments as well as directly with service providers, probably reflecting a little bit of our trials where we're partnering with states and directly. So we're going to have 3 expressions of interest to look for the projects that would come under the fund. The first 2 will be with states and territory governments. The first one has just recently closed, and we did get a lot of interest from state governments. It's fair to say that the state governments that have that experience put in pretty good proposals, and unfortunately states that didn't have as much experience, they were not as sophisticated in their proposals. But there is an opportunity for those states to apply through our second round, where we will seek projects from them, and then a third one will be directly with with service providers. The other part of the fund, while there is the projects, and we expect that there will be up to 10 projects under the Outcomes Fund, because 100 million Australian dollars is actually not a great amount of money. There is the data work and the building the capability. So as Lucy pointed out, those being those challenges, we're focusing on a capability building kind of activity that we can engage with states and territories before the next EOI goes out, so that some of those states with experience can have an opportunity. So choosing the projects is really important, addressing the data challenges and addressing that experience and capability. That's all going to be part of developing the fund, so that it can meet the purpose or the objectives of the fund. So Lucy kind of touched on that around those opportunities, but the purpose of the fund has been that it would reduce disadvantage through innovative funding models, and we will do that through the projects that will impact those people's lives and have reduce that disadvantage. Also improving the evidence base for social policy interventions. So as Lucy said, we're seeing the outcome fund that it provides an opportunity for service providers to run programs that they know that will work, that they can be innovative, and then we can learn from those to say, they were successful, useful. Do we continue those as outcomes-based contracting, or do we fund those through a normal grant? Enabling the development of common standards. So one of the things that we wanted to do was, when we did the first lot of trials, that was very labour intensive. There's lots of infrastructure that we had to put in place. We want to put that in place for the Outcomes Fund. Improve the collaboration between states, generate that data, and basically grow the social impact investing. Just on a point that someone else made about the role of the investor, we're leading up to be within
Judy, sorry, can you hear me?
Sorry. Yes.
Can you hear me? Apologies, I really hate to interrupt you. That was an incredible, very clear presentation. I am just mindful of time and
sure.
Sorry, one of the pains of being the moderator of a really fascinating discussion. That was brilliant. We're a bit over time, so we have slightly less time than we'd hope for the discussion, but I think it was worth every minute and every second. Lucy and Judith, that was incredibly helpful. Great to understand the wider policy context, the amount of capacity building that's gone into this work, and the extent of the co-design exercise. That was something that surprised me. And I'd love to know how you managed to get a 10-year commitment, but let's see if we have time for that. Okay, so we have about just under 10 minutes for some questions from our audience. I see at least one hand up here in the room, and then maybe I'll check with Emily if there are any online questions, but let's go over there in the room first.
Thank you. Hi, Stuart Theobald. I oversee an outcomes fund in South Africa, the Jobs Boost Outcomes Fund, which is $18 million for a pilot phase. And we've just appointed 12 implementation partners, all to create what we call high quality jobs for what we call excluded youth. So South Africa's got a very serious unemployed youth problem, and this is part of the solution. One of the principles that we built into our design was to drive competition between implementation partners. So we spend a lot of time fostering the market to understand outcomes opportunities and to explain to them that we're basically going to auction the money. So we have $18 million and we're going to give it to whoever comes to us for the cheapest cost per job. And we use that mechanism to drive. Now, I'm grossly simplifying it because actually we had a complex scorecard that assessed the quality of the job and lots of different features. And I just wanted to ask the panel what they feel about competition in outcomes funds and using it as a device for effectiveness.
I feel like that's most relevant to EOF College. You want to take that?
Yeah, sure. Happy to go, and maybe you can add if you. No, I think it's a great question. I would say there's definitely trade-offs to consider, because on one hand, we do really truly care about cost effectiveness and value for money. And so we also do use our selection process when we select providers and investors. We do take into account the budget that they're putting forward or the price per outcome that they're putting forward to select the most cost-effective interventions. But I would also kind of, I guess, caution a little bit about having too much of a focus on competition when the market is not yet very mature. I think it works very well when providers are very well aware of their cost, not just of delivering activities, but of achieving outcomes. And that's a little bit the challenge. And I've seen quite a lot of context, what we call winner's curse happen, where it's basically for the providers wanting to get the contract will bid at a low cost, but without having fully understood what it really would take them to achieve outcomes, especially when they're not used to be paid for outcomes. or when they have measured their impact in the past with maybe less rigorous methods. So we've done that, we've seen that quite a few times, and that can really backfire, because ultimately then if they end up in a situation where they under budgeted, then it might even endanger the implementation or their ability to achieve outcomes. So I would say just, I guess, really looking at how mature the market is and how really able they are to bid on targets or pricing in that way.
Thank you, Milena.
Yeah, maybe to add quickly on that, one of the main things that I'm very proud of about our program in Sierra Leone is the amount of collaboration and cooperation that is happening among the different implementing partners. And I'm not sure if competition would 100% crowd that out. It's potentially possible to have both, but usually there's a trade-off between both. And we've seen things like, for example, one grantee had a tool to collect data and to analyze it, and they shared it with another one. And the other one, oh, this is amazing, and this sort of like addresses a challenge that I have with data right now. And they actually were like, can I use it? And now they're using it, right? And that at the end drives better outcomes. So that's what we want. So yeah, I'd be cautious that maybe if they were competing against each other, maybe that sort of things wouldn't be happening, right?
So Anita, I would love to know Lucy's and Judy's thoughts on this. So collaboration is great. We've been talking about it a lot over the past 2 days, but you sit in government, Lucy, you sit in Treasury. So how do you think about the kind of competition between providers? You've mentioned the direct engagement with the market, and being in Treasury, I imagine value for money is something that's high on your list of considerations.
Yeah, it definitely is high on the considerations to make sure, any project that government undertakes is fiscally responsible and within sort of the bounds of our budget. In saying that, in this space in particular, because it's so new and because the market is so nascent, I think we need to look at it with a bit more of a generous eye, I guess, is probably one way of answering it. We need to test these this way of funding in order to shift from our traditional models, in order to see if there's better efficiencies out there and be able to work with the partners. And so I guess the big lesson from the co-design process is how important it is to not just work with, the state and territories who deliver it, but also understand the different service providers and different players in the market and what they need in order to make it a practical model. But I think Judy probably can also speak to the value for money and the elements of how we've designed it.
Yeah, I think you're right, Lucy. I mean, we have such an immature market in Australia that we're testing that model first. We have done some testing with rate cards, which I'm sure you've all had different experiences with, and that's something that we will again be looking at, because then you can get that price.
Super, thank you. I think we can take one more quick question. I see Will's hand went up immediately. I think for Milena and Juanita, you obviously have a chance to talk to them over coffee at the break. Emily, before we take Will's question, I think it would be great to show on the screen for those of you keen to continue the conversation, learn even more about outcome funds. There's a couple of specific opportunities that we wanted to put forward. So while Emily does that, we'll take Will's question and then we'll sadly have to wrap up.
Hello, hi everyone. Will Tyrrell, UK Civil Service. Thanks to the chair and thanks to the panel for your presentations. Mine is for the Australian colleagues, and it's been alluded to slightly. So obviously in the UK we have to hold elections every 5 years, and I know in Australia that is 3 years, which it's repeatedly come up how difficult it can be to get people to think on a longitudinal scale with outcomes-based financing when we have such short-term constraints. I would just really appreciate if you could expand a bit more about, was that a challenge in convincing politicians to adopt this sort of fund-based model, and how did you deal with that?
So an easy question, Will, eh? Thank you. David, Lucy, Judy, take it away. We'll have to keep it relatively brief, though, I'm afraid.
I'm happy to give it a crack. yes, it is always going to be a challenge. However, in saying that, because the Outcomes Fund was developed as part of this package around targeting entrenched disadvantage, that was something that I guess had bipartisan support. And so for us, being able to have that sort of longer term view was slightly less of a challenge in that respect.
Yeah.
And we had the trials were also a 10-year. So we were able to convince the previous government to go for a 10-year. And so there is an understanding that this is just the length that it takes, and we've managed to convince government of that.
That's brilliant. Thank you. Thank you so much, everyone. I'm genuinely sad that we're out of time. First of all, a huge thanks to colleagues in the Australian government who are now joining us quite late. We're really grateful, Lucy, Judy, and David. And we hope that next year you'll be able to join us in person at the conference so we can continue the discussion and then take stock of how much you've learned over that past year. I think you'll have a very keen audience here in Oxford for that. So please then join me in a huge round of applause to our incredible panelists. And it's coffee time for those of you here in the room, and those on Zoom will reconvene in about half an hour. So see you all shortly, and thank you very much again, everyone.
Thank you.